Okay, am I audible properly? Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to the second session of today's South Asian Regional Hub. Today we are gonna discuss about the rising heat waves and mainly how enhancing heat resilience of the marginalized people is vital in order to really tackle the impacts at the grassroots levels. Just a little bit background of the South Asian Regional Hub. It is organized by ICAD, and it is also a lead to the Race to Resilience process for South Asia region. And this hub mainly aims to empower frontline leaders to share their adaptation strategies and also engage with a diverse cohort of stakeholders who are working in this adaptation arena. Before I dive into the session, I would like to introduce myself. I am Afsara Mirza, and I'm currently working as a research officer at International Center for Climate Change and Development. Other than my research interest in locally led adaptation, I have interest in just transition and also recently in the rising heat impacts of Bangladesh and South Asia in general. So today we have brilliant presenters and also panelists. But before I go to their introduction, I would just like to give a background of, why we really thought of doing this session and at this time in the South Asian Regional Hub. As you all know that climate change is increasing the intensity of heat waves and also the frequency, and it's putting more people at risk. And also current projections is suggesting that several Asia and Pacific cities will see temperature rise by as much as 4 degrees Celsius if greenhouse gas emissions remain at current levels. At the same time, this was one of the hottest year. But at the same time, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have also been highlighting the fact that heat has been rising globally. But South Asian countries have been bearing the brunt of it, and a lot of the causes are making this impact very frequent of heat waves. However, the toll is falling on the very marginalized. So, for example, like the day laborers, the urban dwellers, the informal settlements residents, and also women disproportionately. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres have also focused on the fact that we have to protect almost 3.5 billion people by 2050. Otherwise, it can almost cost us 1 trillion a year in terms of the loss of productivity when it comes to heat waves and its impact on the various aspects of our lives. So before I introduce the panelists and also the speakers, I would just like to give a brief overview of the agenda. I will be moderating the session, and soon a Mentimeter will be shared with you. We have 2 Mentimeter sessions, and the links will be shared by my colleagues in the chat box. So do feel free to give your response in the Mentimeter. Then 2 of my colleagues from ECAD, Savio and Nishat, they will give us an overview of heat impacts in Bangladesh and how it's taking a toll on the marginalized population, mainly based on their research on rickshaw pullers and also in general of the rising heat wave trends. Then we will move to the panel discussion. Where we have Dr. Hurara Jabin, who's an academic and development professional, and she will discuss the feasible ways to reduce heat waves impacts in South Asia in the rapidly urbanizing cities, and also share with us some of the initiatives that she has worked on and is working on currently. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers. We have with us Nishat Tasni, who has been working as a research officer at the International Center for Climate Change and Development. And she has been a part of ICAD since a long time, but she joined us in December 2023. And she has previously been at ICAD and involved with it due to our youth mentorship programs, and has worked in Asian Development Bank, the COS International Nature. We also have with us as a presenter Savio Russo Rosario, who's currently working as a program coordinator at International Center for Climate Change and Development of locally led adaptation program. His research interest lies in disaster risk reduction, locally led adaptation, nature-based solution. Previously, he had interned in BRAC James P. Grant School of Public Health and at the International Center for Diarrheal Diseases Research. Savio has actually double masters in disaster management and also in climate change and development. And he completed his bachelor's of science from Independent University Bangladesh based in Bangladesh. We also have with us Hurare Jabin, ma'am, Dr. Hurare Jabin, ma'am. She's an academician and development professional. Her key research focus is in urban resilience, gender, and the built environment, especially focusing on the intersection of gender and gender dynamics of adaptation of climate risks in informal settlements and also urban areas of Bangladesh. Her scholarly research experience on climate change adaptation and risk reduction of urban households contribute to her emerging international profile from presenting and publishing for academics, professionals, and policymakers. Her professional work also entails working with urban local government institutes of Bangladesh for planning and implementing, and also urban development projects and programs. She contributes immensely in policymaking related to climate change and urban development in Bangladesh. She has wide experience working with civil society organizations, donors, and the community members. She teaches and researches with the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, BRAC University, as a visiting fellow, and she's also a consultant to the Urban Resilience and Land Global Practice, South Asia region of the World Bank. We are also supposed to expect another panelist, Bushra Afrin, who's a chief heat officer to Dhaka North, appointed by the Ashraf Foundation. Her role has been established in response to the city's pressing heat challenges. In her capacity, Bushra is leading heat adaptive solutions in collaboration and partnership with various stakeholders within and beyond the city. Her priority as a chief heat officer has been to include Dhaka's most vulnerable population in climate policy research and action, to pursue equitable measures in making Dhaka cooler and safer, particularly women and children, and to shape Dhaka's resilience plan. So that was pretty much it of the introductions of the speakers, and also what we're aiming to achieve out of this whole session. My colleague, I would like to request you to share the Mentimeter screen. The first Mentimeter question is up in your chat box. So please click on the first link that my colleague shared, and we will show the responses in the screen. If you click on the Mentimeter link, you would be able to vote. I can only see 3 responses. Would request everyone to vote. Is everyone being able to use the Menti link? Are you facing any difficulties? Anyways, I think we can move to the next question, if that's okay. Nice. Yes, and the question was mainly that did Bangladesh face its longest heat wave in recorded history this year? And yes, that's true. This year we have faced the longest heat wave in history, which actually led to school closures. Which when I was a school goer, I never faced that issue. But this time, a lot of school were shut down due to the inconvenience of heat wave and the risk associated with health. If we move to the next question, please, if you can share the next Mentimeter question. And the link to the question is given by my colleague Mehdi in the chat box. So the next question really talks about how does heat really impact us, and I think since heat is it impacts all of our lives and the way we actually live every day. So I think it really impacts everything, like the three factors that's mentioned, like the health impacts, the social impacts, and also the economic impacts. Nice. Thank you everyone for the responses. Great to see everyone participating in the surveys. Always encouraging. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're pretty much all on the same board in terms of agreeing that heat really impacts these three factors. And going to the next segment of the session, I would like to invite both my colleagues, Savio and Nishak, to give us an overview of the heat impacts in Bangladesh and share the findings from their research, mainly related to the overall impacts of how it has been impacting the rapidly urbanized, populated city, but also in general on the marginalized population, like the rickshaw pullers, and also the way forward. So I would like my colleagues to share the PowerPoint presentation, and I would also invite Savio and Nisha to take over now. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Afsar Apu. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. A very good afternoon, everyone. I am Nishat Taslim, and today me, along with my fellow colleague, Mr. Sabio Rosario, we intend to inform you about the heat vulnerabilities right now in Bangladesh. And after the end of this presentation, we hope that we were able to enlighten you on ways you can improve the life of the marginal community of Bangladesh. Well, the people from this community are the very people who earns less than $2 per day, living under the poverty line, but they end up spending more, both in terms of money and also in terms of their health, despite they are not the they do not generate the causes behind this thermal discomfort. Next slide, please. Well, in front of you, you can see headlines. Well, when I informed about heat vulnerability, I'm sure in many of your mind, it must have struck that maybe I'm going to be talking about global warming and its increasing temperature. But global warming is not the main and the only heat vulnerability right now. Urban heat island effect and heat waves are some of the two most pressing heat vulnerable issues, and especially for Bangladesh and its megacity Dhaka. Because in Dhaka, not everyone is aware about the changes that is happening due to the heat wave and urban heat island, because they tend to think these are the effects coming from the global warming. But what if I tell you, if for example, there are no global warming, there are no climate change, but still Dhaka would undergo with its other vulnerabilities, it would undergo this very same heat vulnerabilities. And why is it so? In a while, my fellow colleague, he'll be explaining to you in much detail. Next slide, please. Well, as you can see globally, the temperature has been increasing due to climate change and global warming. As the carbon emissions seem to be increasing, the temperature is also increasing. In the last 2 decades, globally, there has been a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. And in South Asia only, it is predicted by 2035, 0.9 degrees Celsius rise of temperature will take place. And in between 2005 and the year 2021, in Dhaka alone, the temperature has raised by 0.11 degrees Celsius. And it is predicted that, not predicted actually, it is as stated that every year the temperature of Dhaka is rising between 0.023 degrees Celsius to 0.03 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. Well, across the globe, the vulnerability of the heat and the nature and its effect and impact all varies. For example, in the countries that are surrounded by ocean, they receive high temperature because of high humidity. In a country like ours that resides in the tropic, even during low atmospheric pressure, we go through a thermal stress. And in drier countries that lack in moisture, high heat can also cause forest fires, as we've seen in previous cases in the Western countries and even in the drier parts of USA. Funnily, even Antarctica also undergoes through a heat wave periodically when there are no clouds in the sky, because these clouds, they actually act as a barrier preventing sun rays entering the continent. And during no cloud days, clear skies, when they do enter, the ice and polar ice caps, they reflect the heat and trapping it within the surface, not letting the heat go back to where it came from. So Antarctica do periodically undergo through heat wave, which not many of us are concerned about, but we should be. Next slide, please. Well, here in this slide, you can see why we are so much concerned about the vulnerabilities. Because when there is high heat, of course, there is a loss of concentration, exhaustion, and physically other health conditions, they also get triggered, which might need to be admitted to hospitals and also causes mortality. In recorded cases in Bangladesh alone, in 2003, 62 cases of heat stroke took place. And in 2005, a BBC documentary did show that 3,500 people died during heatwave episodes. In 2014 alone, in ICDDRB, there were 786 patients who were admitted during because of heat stress, undergoing diarrheal issues. So you can see in Dhaka, these cases were there, but it was never addressed because we were unaware or we were not giving any importance to other developed countries that their emission is causing this. But in true sense, they are not only responsible, even our planners and our expert and policymakers, they are also to a certain degree need to be aware. Next slide, please. Well, in front of you, I present you a map. Like I said, a while ago, I was making statement that without even global warming, without climate change issues, Dhaka would go under through a heat vulnerability. And here's a brush up of that. This is the map of Dhaka city in front of you guys. Well, urban planners and experts, according to them, it is stated that any city or town that is situated on a bank of a river, tall infrastructure should be constructed at the river banks, and there should be certain gaps in between the buildings, because the temperature and the air quality is controlled by the wind currents coming from these rivers. These rivers control the temperature and also the atmospheric metrics. And but you'll notice that Dhaka is surrounded by 4 rivers. The light green line that you see, it represents the eastern side of Dhaka. Over there, there is Balu River. And the maroon line that you see on the west, that is the Turak River. The black one at the top, that is the Tungi Canal. And the bottle green one in the south, that is the Buriganga River. And the purple line that you see, that is Shitalokha River, that is running parallel to the Balu River. Some experts also say Dhaka is actually surrounded by 5 rivers. Some might argue, no, it's actually in 4. But nevertheless, now you know that Dhaka is surrounded by rivers on all of its side. But if you give a thought, you will know that all the residential areas, they are situated in the banks of river. And these residential areas, they have high infrastructure, closely knit ones. They act as a boundary, hindering the wind flow pattern, not allowing the proper wind to leave, and the cooler wind coming from the river inside. And this is also another reason why Dhaka tops in terms of air pollution, because this wind also dilutes the air pollutants. But because of these tall infrastructures, the wind cannot leave properly, and there are no enough wind flow that can regulate both the temperature and also the pollution. These are some of these reasons are the major reasons. Then second comes Dhaka's built environment. Because of unplanned urbanization and fast urbanization, we have prioritized a cheap quality construction material. This material, yes, they're cheap, but they trap heat. They trap immense amount of heat. Some literature even suggested this Dhaka's 89% of built material is made up of not heat-friendly materials, as they tend to trap the heat and act as a heater, heating our surface, heating our environment. So and also lack of green cover is also making the situation worse, because day by day due to deforestation and loss of greenery, the amount of carbon sequestration that would take place previously is decreasing. It is also contributing. So these are some of the major causes why Dhaka is getting overheated, why its surface is acting as a heater and causing thermal distress. The rich, unfortunately or fortunately, they can buy stuff to improve their life, but the poor people, they cannot. They have to actually endure this rat. And for this reason, Dhaka's people and Dhaka's policy maker, they should actually consider retrofitting its built environment. Next slide, please. Well, I'm going to conclude my session by brushing up on this topic. While researching about the existing heat wave adaptation plan for other countries, I came across this ingenious idea that was adopted by the heat wave adaptation plan in Ahmedabad, India. And it was so successful that the Indian government has now mandated that all Indian government agencies should adopt a cool roof. Well, the idea is with this project, it was intended to improve the thermal stress indoors. Well, in indoor situation, if you can change the roof, if it can control the amount of temperature going inside. There are 5 ways it is suggested, and the first one is a coated cool roof. Over there, you paint your roof with a reflecting paint that can reflect the light rays. Or if you cannot afford the paint, you can do a quick, just coat it with lime wash. Then come the membrane cool roof. It is mostly targeted for the slum settlement and squatter settlement, people who do not have ownership of their house. Over there, they covered the roof with an insulating material, which is shiny in nature. That also helps in keeping the temperature inside of your house in control. Then come the tile cool roof. Over there, like a tile that is insulating in nature and is reflective, that reflects sun rays, that can also keep the house inside cooler. Then, and the fourth one is also mostly directed for the people are living under the poverty line. Over there, mod roof, it is usually intended to mimic a concrete roof, but unlike concrete roof, it do not absorb heat. It is mostly imitated using coconut husk and paper waste. But during the rainy season, the mod roof do tend to get destroyed. And the fifth one, we all have heard about it, green roof, which is basically your rooftop gardening. This was all from my side. Now I would like to hand over the floor to my fellow colleague, Mr. Sabio.
Thank you, Nishat. Can you hear me? Yes, I think I'm audible. Yes. Okay, thank you, Apsara, for confirming, and thank you everyone for joining us in this session. And my colleague here, Nishat, she has rightly mentioned about the challenges that we are facing in terms of heat and the challenges that are coming up in the mega city Dhaka. So my focus is a bit more on the urban marginalized communities living in Dhaka city. And by urban marginalized communities, I mean the people those who lack the access to formal economic and infrastructural rights and resources. And in this regard, my research focused on the rickshaw pullers, and rickshaw pullers being a group of urban marginalized communities living in Dhaka. There are numerous literatures that support that they belong to an economic hardship group, they face social disparities, there are issues of legal rights and occupational health safety hazards, and also their access to various wash services, which includes water, sanitation, and hygiene. And there are also a lot of research that talk about how they are being exposed to extreme heat as because of their nature of work. They have to be exposed in broad daylight for more than, on an average, from 9 hours to 10 hours or more than that. So all these factors are actually uh, summing up the impacts, how the extreme heat is influencing their income and well-being. So in my particular research, I identified three gaps. The first gap comes as the research gap. So the literature that I have reviewed for the work, most of the literature, it talks about the special analysis, where you get to see a lot of land cover, land cover changes, and how it's impacting the entire urban heat island scenario. But there are very limited researches in the social aspect, where it connects the impacts of heat spreads with the vulnerable and the most marginalized communities in the society. The second gap that I identified from the research was the policy gap. So till the last two policies that we had for climate change in Bangladesh, the National Adaptation Plan and the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan, except these two policies, heat was excluded from of every other policy that related to climate change. And it was just a subsection of temperature rise. So we really never thought of the heat impacts separately, or what could be happening in the near future. And then comes the executional challenges, the executional gap. So there are there are lack of understanding in the vulnerability and also on evidence-based actions, by which I mean when we're taking any sort of solutions or any sort of decision making, to what extent it is coming from the very local level, this also needs to be considered. So with that, I would like to move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is how I try to design my study. So I try to incorporate the impacts of global warming, the temperature rise, along with the urban heat island impact. And together we have two dimensional impacts. The first comes as direct impact, which is on the income and income generation, and to what extent the income generation is impacting their well-being and health. So to understand this, I try to come up with a comparative research where I chose two different areas within Dhaka North City Corporation. So one of the area was a CBD, a central business district, and the other area was a residential area. And why I chose these two areas, I will be explaining that a bit later. But before that, let me also talk about the objectives for my research. So I tried to look at the temperature change, first of all, and also the urban heat island impact, putting in the spatial analysis. To what extent the spatial analysis is driving the urban heat island impact. The second was whether this extreme heat is influencing the income generation of the marginalized communities, and in this regard, the rickshaw pullers. And the third objective I had was their health and well-being. And as I know that the health and well-being is a very broad aspect, and I couldn't cover everything within a short span of time, as I had some resource limitation. So I took only one aspect, and that was their regular water intake. And I considered that, and I tried to analyze whether the extreme heat is also impacting the water intake or not. And finally, the last but not the least was the objectives. And when we are talking about developing a heat action plan and also including the marginalized communities' voices, so to what extent our policies regard this? So one of the analysis of my work was also a policy analysis, where I reviewed the policies starting from dating back from 2000 till 2024. And then if I can move to the next slide, please. So here we go. This is how I designed my methodology. As you can see from the map, there were 2 study areas, and I incorporated all 3 factors here: the primary literature, the secondary data analysis, and also the spatial data analysis. And together I came up with my results and discussions. So the reason I chose the CBD and the residential area, 2 different areas, because I want to do a comparative analysis and I tried to understand whether the impacts are being disproportionate or not. And then comes the population density, also the governance services and support services. And sure, definitely the greenery should also be considered. And therefore, I also incorporated this factor. And in the CBDs, as you can see from my slide, there ward number 26 and 27 from DNCC was selected. And in terms of the residential area, I chose Bosundara to be one of my study sites. Can you move to the next slide, please? So these are the 5 results, I would say, that came up from my study. So after doing the extensive literature review and also the data analysis, and this data I got from the BMD website, and also I tried to gather data from other sources. And what I found out since 1990 till 2022, within this 3 decades, the temperature rise was directing to around 0.13 degrees Celsius increase per decade. And if you compare the temperature rise, the annual maximum temperature rise from 1990 till 2022, it went up from 32 degrees Celsius to almost 38 degrees Celsius. So that's a massive change. And then if I'm considering the summer months, and summer months here in Bangladesh, as per the BMD, they suggest that from April till June are the summer months, is basically the pre-monsoon season. So during this time, there were also significant changes in the temperature. And the worrying factor is that it's not only the maximum temperature is increasing, but also the minimum temperature is also increasing. If we go to the next slide, please. Then the other aspect I got into my research was the land use, land cover change. I wanted to see whether this is impacting the urban heat island impact or not. And there are numerous literatures, again, supporting that land use, land cover change is directly related to the urban heat island impact. So the more it changes, the more it is getting urbanized, there are higher chances for urban heat island impacts. And from my research, what I find that the expansion rate has been around 33%. And currently the build-up area is 64% in the Dhaka city. This rate might vary from research to research because these are spatial data analysis and it is all over the year and it just gives us a snapshot. So this might vary from year to year or from research to research. But then again, I would say that this surely has an impact on the urban heat island. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this was the main center of attraction of my work because this is where I wanted to explore more. So this was basically the interviews. The results comes from the interviews from the rickshaw pullers. And what I see is from the interviews that there is a statistical significance with the working hours and monthly income. So the more than 71% of the respondents from both the studies, they said that exposure to extreme heat, especially within the time 12 o'clock to 2 p.m., it is actually impacting their income. And the responses were significantly higher from CBD area, which means the Farmgate area comparing to Bosundara area. And then if I'm talking about the income and the daily water consumption, so I took the standard rates from occupational safety health OSHA. This is a website from US agency where they talk about the minimal amount of the safe drinking water standards. They set the standards, and considering that, I've also found that like 93% of the study population, they drink less than the standard rates. And if I'm comparing within the 2 areas, so people from Bosundara area, they're drinking 13 times more. They're getting the access to drink more water 13 times comparing to the respondents from farm gate area. And then again, there were also another statistical significance within this comparison. Accessing pure drinking water in Boshundhara, there are accesses to get drinking water from water stations, filtered water stations, which is not even an option in farm gate area. And if you look at the sources in farm gate area, the rickshaw pullers, they're accessing drinking water from tea stalls, tap water, and different types of hotels. So that also brings us to a concern whether these are hygienic or not. And with that in our mind, can we go to the next slide, please? I also tried to look at the drinking water awareness, whether these respondents are aware about their water sources. So it was that only 40% of the people were aware of the water sources, and most of the respondents came from Boshundhara. Like the people in Boshundhara were more aware comparing to the people from Farmgate. And similar observations were also noticed in terms of the disease awareness, where we asked them about the waterborne diseases, and it was much higher in Boshundhara area comparing to Farmgate. It was also noted that more than 84% of our study respondents, they abstained from visiting doctors when they were suffering from any sort of waterborne diseases, or, they were, and it was also found out that people with a lower income, by lower income, I mean people earning less than 20,000 per month, they paid fewer visits to the doctor, which is very natural because if your income is low, then you will be paying less visit to the doctor. But we need to understand whether heat is impacting their income or not, which was actually defined in one of my previous observations. And there are also literatures which state that if the temperature goes beyond 29 degree and it increases by 1 degree, 40% increase in the diarrheal disease rate is observed in Dhaka city. So this comes from various literature, and this also supports the findings that I have from my research work. Let me go to the next slide, please. So at the very end, I'm almost at the end. There are some recommendations, and these recommendations are grounded not only from literature, but also from the community, the respondents I met. And I also had the opportunity to meet some experts in the field, and they also recommended us all these factors. So there are 7 interventions that I would like to talk about. The first comes as defining the heat waves. So till date, there are no particular definitions on heat waves, to the best of my knowledge. So I think this can be considered. And as per the World Meteorological Department and also the Indian Meteorological Department, they pretty much have a definition when they're generating the heat alarms. So I think this can also be replicated in our country. Then comes the heat early warning systems, which is a crucial and an essential thing to develop, I would say. And also the coordination and dissemination is also important, because these messages or these warnings needs to be disseminated at the very local level. And in this regard, the social media, the telecommunication services, the mass media can play a vital role. This was pretty much effective during the COVID times, if we can recall. Like there were SMSs or warnings about COVID-19 outbreaks and spreads and how to prevent this. There were a lot of SMSs and during that time. So maybe we can adopt something very similar to generate the heat early warning systems. Also, the capacity enhancing program for medical professionals, because I also got a chance to meet some of the medical professionals during my research, and then they said they really need to build their capacity on how to treat patients suffering from various heat stress conditions. Then comes the public and private partnership. Definitely, this is important to invest in something innovative, and the private sectors should also contribute significantly. And also the infrastructural development is important. By infrastructural development, we can say pedestrian roads and like shelters, some fountains, and also conserving the water bodies within the city. And last but not the least is the urban greening and landscape management. So there are data like since 1989 till 2020, Dhaka's urban greening reduced by 68%, and currently only the land tree cover remains at 8%. So that is a significant change over the years. So there can be initiatives to protect and safeguard and also scale this sort of urban greening initiative. And this cannot be done overnight, right? All of these interventions that we are suggesting can't be done overnight. So we can also come up with a timeline from 2 years till 10 years, and we can segregate all these recommendations, like from starting from a very immediate measure to a long-term measure. And I've also proposed this in my research work. With that, I think I will conclude and I'll stop there. And thank you for inviting me. These are some clips from the field work and the data collection that we did. Thank you, everyone. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Savio and Nishat, for a very exciting presentation. I think it was so informative, and I believe it was as well for all the participants who have joined us today for this session. I think you have some requests in the chat box to share your presentation and also your research. And just to recap from your informative presentation is that thank you for giving us an overview of the rising heat wave trends in Bangladesh and how multifaceted its impact is on health and well-being in general. But also, I think heat also has an impact on the biodiversity as well, as you mentioned. And I think something to highlight is also the land use and land cover change, which is leading to high urban heat island impact. And your research was very interesting in the sense that it really highlighted what challenges rickshaw pullers are exposed to in a daily basis. As you mentioned, that 93% of the sample of your survey, it said that they drank less water than the standard daily consumption, which is also can be damaging to the health. And waterborne diseases are also a key factor which has been coming to limelight in the recent heat waves. Just to highlight, and this will take us lead to the next segment of our session, which is the panel discussion with two inspiring panelists. And I really liked your recommendation on urban greening, and it is a starting figure that we have lost almost 68% of our forest coverage in the city, which is also threatening. But I believe there is solutions, and I would also like to highlight on the fact that early warning system is key, information dissemination is key, as you mentioned, but taking a locally led approach to it is very important. So making sure that everything is circulated in Bengali is vital as well. And infrastructural development, absolutely, I agree on that. Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation, and I will move on to the next segment of the panel discussion. In the first, I would like to invite Dr. Jabin. As I mentioned, she's an academic and development professional, and she has years of experience working on the nexus of climate change, gender, and also urban issues. So Jabin, ma'am, if I go to you, I would really like to ask you, based on this presentation, I know you echoed with a lot of the recommendation that was there, but you're also working on a lot of inspiring projects, initiatives. So if you could share some of the feasible ways or practical solutions that we can take to reduce heat wave impacts in South Asia's rapidly urbanizing cities, that would be great. And also it would be great if you can also touch on the fact on the how multifaceted the impacts of heat are on women, and it affects women disproportionately. So over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Afsara, for inviting. And I was listening to the previous presentation, and I was thinking, yes, there's a lot of common things that we all are now talking about in reference to different group of people. Those kind of information are very important for me personally, because when I, as you mentioned, that I am more interested to look into any of the issues related to climate change or disaster is the gender lens, how men and women are impacted differently and how the established gender roles or access to livelihood or access to asset, different kind of asset actually changes within the city and others. So definitely what the last two presenters talked about are something that we are experiencing every day. So now if we think about, we are saying Dhaka is rapidly urbanizing, and what do we do and what are the future about that? So we hear a lot of negative things about Dhaka. But what my understanding that this is not something that is only can be blamed for Dhaka, or we cannot just say it is an urbanization issue. Because if you think about a city is composed of its people, how people act, how people react to things. So if we start with the heat, and it's very interesting to maybe research further to see how in the city's context, people perceive heat, or the terminology people are using. Are we saying heat wave? Are we saying just too hot? Or are we saying, yes, it's summer, it's supposed to be hot? It has a lot to do with the terminology, how we perceive heat, how we, and depending on our perception, we actually act or react. As the previous slide was showing, that some of the rickshaw pullers did not think about the quality of water, whether it will bring them waterborne diseases or not. So this quality of water or access to water, all these kinds of concerns comes with how we perceive the heat and how we perceive our access to services in the city and how we act or react on the quality of those services. So in a city, we have low-income household, we have high-income household, people who can afford cooling equipments like air conditioner, people who may not have access to even the basic structure, basic services. So in a city, when we think about a city, the first thing that we usually do or try to do is to do a risk assessment. Of course, the numbers which the climate data gives us, the projection, the historical data, of course, these are very important for us to get one dimension of idea. But there's a gap, still a gap, I would say, in Bangladesh, that where when we get this data, these data are mostly of outdoor air temperature and mostly the land surface temperature. It does not take the ambient heat into the consideration or the moisture content into the air. And most of the data collection centers in Bangladesh are located maybe in a district or in a not multiple places even in a city like Dhaka. So what it makes difficult for us to say, when we talk about Dhaka, we generalize the city as a whole, but we don't talk about the change in density. We don't talk about the availability or green, or what we call the green and blue infrastructure, the water bodies or other. That becomes a very important data for outdoor temperature, but also we don't have any data about the indoor temperature. I don't know how many will be able to relate with me, but in most of the cases, often we find out that our outdoor temperature is actually lower than our indoor temperature because of our building materials, how we have constructed the building, the design of the building, the gap between buildings, the orientation of the buildings towards the sun, or the possibility of having a ventilation options within our building or even our room. So all of those are very important data, because if we are thinking about trying to adjust with heat wave or heat stress in the future, the indoor temperature becomes a key issue. And also, I'm very happy to see that you have started to look into the marginalized group as not one group of people. Different groups can be marginalized based on different issues. For example, when we talk about marginality of women, they may come from a very high income background with good economic opportunity, but there are certain issues that can make them comparatively more at risk than the other people. For example, the clothing choices of women, the physiological characteristics, because a female body has less surface to volume temperature, so that makes her more vulnerable to heat. Or when we think about the unpaid domestic work that happens within the household, which often impacts the women who are working outside as well, because they will have to lose precious productive time for their reproductive work. And in a country like Bangladesh, or in city like Dhaka, where we see the most employed, almost 90% of the employed female member work in the informal sector, where you do not have a very good working condition to adjust with the heat, can become a major issue to think about when we are thinking about cities population. So when we do our risk assessment, we try to incorporate not only the climate data, the temperature data, but also the peoples, the different kind of vulnerable people, how to do that. The next thing that becomes very important in urban resilience planning is the resources. We may say a lot of things that, yes, we need to do that. We need to increase water supply. We need to increase power generation. We need to think about investing in housing. But in order to do that, what we are facing, because if we talk about heat wave, general people are recognizing it as a heat wave for the last 2 years. And so when the heat wave come, persons like Bushra becomes the attention of all media, because as if she can solve it within a day, which we have been ruining for years after years. So, and I'm sure Bushra can talk more, but when we try to find people who can say, okay, what should we do now, like immediately and in the midterm, in the long term, there are a lot of gaps in the technical ability or the human resources, where we have a very good idea about the extent of the impact, the nature of the impact, and based on that, what we can do. So we do definitely have human resource lacking or with technical skills, but also we have started to develop the institutional framework where who can work around it. For example, for the first time, heatwave has been added into the disaster risk in Bangladesh, where the Standing Committee of Order, what we call the SOD in disaster, that gets triggered in. So before 2 years, nobody cared about heatwave, but we were suffering for decades now. So this kind of institutional structure is very important, but also how the different institution and organization work together. We often see the meteorological department saying, we have all this data. And when I say, well, what is meant for me? That's where we struggle. So thank God we have the smartphone who say that it feels like that, and you should take your umbrella or others. But the question is, how many individuals own those mobile phone with this kind of app? So of course, information is there. Of course, the institutions are there to give us this information, but can I interpret those data, and whether the meteorological department is actually talking to the city corporation saying, there's tomorrow is a bad day, so you should ensure this, or can advise the industry saying your workers will be suffering tomorrow most, try to give them a break within the work. So it's about the coordination, because when we think about urban areas not one person's thing. We often tend to blame the mayor, saying that person, the mayor did not do that, or we just say the disaster management department didn't do that. But urban system is a very complex system where different organization needs to work together. I think we are still yet to figure out how we can work together among different organizations. And one of the things that comes to discussion is that, yes, we want to do a lot of things. Where the money is going to come from? Who is going to finance those kind of activity? The city may say that, yes, we need to plant trees. But in a city where 90 to 95% of the land are owned by the private owners, and if you want to plant a tree, nobody will give you the land to plant trees. So the city needs to buy land to plant trees. The city needs access to resources to give access to water. The water supply departments need lines to give free water to in the informal settlement. So the financial resources we often talk about, but not at the beginning, almost towards the end, and that's where we hit the wall that, oops, yes, what do we do? But because of my background, because I come from a very built environment background, I want to highlight three things, what we can do, or we are trying to push to think about to do, is first one is the building code. I know people who live in Bangladesh, live in Dhaka, tend to think that the building codes are to constrain us and not let us utilize fully the land we have. If we could have covered the whole of our site. But what the building code does not explains to us that why we need to have a setback rule, why we are saying that in between the two buildings, we need this minimum space, because that ensures your light and ventilation. If you assess, there's a very good assessment where you can show whether the place, the building that you are living, how good it in terms of the energy efficiency. So it says that if your building does not have 40% of your surface being open for ventilation, you will not have adequate ventilation. So our building codes have been developed on informations like this, but what we probably lack is this explanation that why should we ensure it. So we often feel like it's the Rajuk's responsibility. They will come and say, you didn't make the windows. But I think it's time for us to spread the news among the people that you need those windows because you need to have better ventilation, which will help you to reduce your air conditioner bills need or electricity bills need. So building code is one where through which we can incorporate or start suggesting simple measures like painting the roof with a reflective paint, or creating another layer in the roof to reduce heat. Those kind of things we can do from the city's perspective through the building codes. The other one is definitely the streetscape. If anybody goes through the Bijaya Sharani these days, you'll see there's a very linear chunk of green space. And sometimes I just feel like, what if we had filled it with bigger trees and not just made it a beautiful green lawn, rather we had more trees, what would it have impacted? So the reason that I'm saying it, it's not only leaving open space as green. What we need to do is to develop the streetscape. When I say streetscape, it combines plantation, it combines place to sit, it combines even having access to drinking water. So our city still thinks the road as a vehicular movement path. Our urban designers or our city dwellers do not perceive the city as an open space. We still think this is road and outside and it's none of my business. But what the heat wave are showing us, if I'm not comfortable inside, I need to go outside, and streets in Dhaka are the only space in some cases where we can get that comfort. So streetscape design is very important for us. The other thing, at a bigger city level, we have to think about the zoning, the building height, the density. The higher the density, the bigger the possibilities that people will be vulnerable in those areas. Because if you think about Lalbagh area, you will see houses where even in rooms, 3 meter by 3 meter or 9 square meter, 100 square feet, you can say, in a room, you will have 4 to 5% living. So that overcrowding is not helpful, because when you are having a heat wave, that can actually increase the vulnerability of even a healthy, normal person, like person. So in this way, it's not possible for the individual to decide on that. It becomes the city planner's responsibility to try to find out how to balance, how to sort of create a balance between the built environment and the open spaces. So what I'm sorry, I cannot give you exact example of we have done this. I think Bushra will be able to do that more. But what through my work with different local government agencies or designing, where we are trying to support them in designing, these are some of the issues that we are trying to push forward, trying to think about how to change the building code, incorporate small, doable, but efficient changes when local governments are thinking about preparing or designing public buildings or public spaces, or even the street design. We are trying to push them to think about it's not just a path or it's not just a building. It's a space where people will be coming as a respite from the heat because their home is not adequately equipped enough. So we are even thinking about the community centers that are there, the ground floor of the community center, which often are not used during the day. Can we think about converting them as a cooling center during March, April? Just a few activities, few things, can we do that? So these are some things that the urban local government are in position to do because they have a responsibility about the public health. They have a responsibility to make sure the well-being of the people, not just access to water. So these are something that we are trying bits and pieces in different places. Hopefully in future, people will come up with their interesting more ideas. So we are looking forward to more people's innovative ideas to help us to develop something that we can do, within a short limitation of resources and limitation of all of the things that we talk about. So I'll stop here and thank you. And I think Bushra will be able to give you more concrete example, and I'll be very happy to know about that. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Jabin. I think that was so informative and so inspiring. Like, yeah, you basically, summed up like the way forward. So, for example, like, what you mentioned about heat, like, how do we feel about heat? Like, does everyone perceive heat by heat or by some other way, like on a gorom lagche, or like kyo batas khete jacche or something like that, like you want to go out and feel getting the fresh air or something. So I feel like defining heat also does vary from country to country. So I think that's also very important to consider. One of the things that really touched me was the factor that you mentioned about indoor temperature, and sometimes how we don't consider it all the time. We always consider the outdoor temperature, but building materials, the design of building, the orientation of building, ventilations, all of this can play a role. And for example, as you mentioned, can be actually the new indicators of building heat, I would say, heat resilient building or something like that. I also, wanted to highlight on the fact that how you mentioned the disproportionate impact of heat falling on women, especially marginalized women who are working as day laborers or doing unpaid care work, working as house helps in different homes in Dhaka and also in peri-urban areas. The impact falls greater on them. Also, another point to highlight from your discussion is that we also lack the human resource at the moment, who can actually define that what heat means for Bangladesh and how we can actually increase the resilience of the marginalized population at first, and then it can be a very bottom-up approach. And hence today's title was enhancing heat resilience for the marginalized people through a locally led action. So it has to be very embedded in local and lived realities. So I think that's very important. One of the things I also wanted to highlight is that how you mentioned that this was the first time that heat wave is mentioned in the standing order. So that's very important, and I think that's a good start to also mention about. Of course, financial resources is key, but of course, tracking and monitoring that finance will be also vital. And as you mentioned, that coordination is so important between the ministries, between different stakeholders, living in cities, and not only blaming the government, but also working in a holistic manner. For example, how can private sector better support? How can different academicians and universities really help with the data sets, with the data to work on as a way forward. And I totally completely agree with you about the Sharani that we can have more trees there for sure, and of course like Old Dhaka or like Lalbagh area and all of these areas where we didn't think way ahead of how urban planning would look in the next decade, and hence I feel like the population living there will face a disproportionate impact. I really liked your suggestion on the city planners having a balance between the built environment and also open spaces. I think that's very important, and yeah, very inspiring. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all this important, valuable information. And that takes me to my last panelist, Bushra Afrin, who's the Chief Heat Officer of Dhaka North, and has been doing a lot of implementing actually a lot of actions and developing a lot of localized strategies to reduce heat impacts. Over to you, Bushrapu, to really listen about what you have done so far and also what the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Afsara, for this wonderful session. And thank you, Hurera Appa, for the shout outs. And thank you, Savio and Nishat, for your wonderful presentations as well. They were very informative. And Savio actually mentioned this research to me the last time I saw him. So I feel really good that it's ready. And, there was the research on rickshaw pullers is actually extremely important because it is it even shows you that from amongst this niche population of rickshaw pullers, there are differences in waterborne diseases and infections and hospitalizations and so forth. So it really shows you the different variations of, as he put it, the UMC's urban marginalized communities. So really shows you these differences. As Hurera mentioned as well, there's different types of vulnerabilities, marginalized, there's different types of marginalization. So it অনেক নিখুঁত ভাবে, like you have to take a very nuanced approach to really thinking about what kind of solutions could work for a group of people for a specific place. The first things that when I became a chief heat officer, it felt like an impossible problem, right? It felt like, how do we even start? Where do we start? And we needed to have, we know that marginalized people are the most affected. So that's where we looked at. We looked at informal settlements. We looked at 15 informal settlements. And we looked at, okay, what is a common thing? What is a common feature that they would all be interested in, or they would all be, because we needed to have a conversation about heat, but we also needed to be cognizant and mindful of the fact that these areas are so vulnerable in so many different ways that how do you even bring up the topic of heat? How do you tell them that, hey, there's another, I'm sure তোমাদের গরম লাগছে, but here I'm going to speak about it and make you more aware that this is a problem that you need to be wary of, and without giving you any solutions. So we needed to talk to them in a way that here, we want to, we would love to work with you to plant some trees. So, we want to, let's plant some trees. But because that was also not being done. So as we know that most of our marginalized populations within Dhaka city, I'm just going to be talking about Dhaka North. So as we all know that most marginalized communities live in informal settlements, right? And informal settlements are called that because the land that they're living on is not not necessarily, land that is legally okay for them to stay in, right? If for lack of a better word. And these areas have been historically ignored from local government to like do any type of permanent structures in. So that means that they don't want to build there, they don't want to plant trees there, they don't want to do anything that, like the auditing companies, for example, can come in and be like, why did you spend money there? Unless it's their area. And when we talk about land ownership, I really want to, as Hurapa mentioned as well, like it's the city doesn't own on all the land or all the resources, or it doesn't have control over water, doesn't have control over electricity, doesn't have control to a lot of essential services that are so important when it comes to addressing heat vulnerability. তাই না? Like গরম লাগলে ফ্যান ছাড়ো, গরম লাগলে পানি খাও, গোসল করো. So these are things that people who live in these communities are often barred from, maybe because they don't have access to power in that moment, maybe because they're getting overcharged for using electricity, like they're paying triple the amount of electricity per unit than somebody living in like Bonani is, for example, maybe sometimes 20 times more. So এই ক্ষেত্রে 2 দিন ফ্যান চালাইছে, একটা লাইট অন করেছে, and turns out the bill became 1000 টাকা. So these are like daily problems that really, really, like, then you have a choice, like আমি কি like, should I turn on a fan or should I buy food? It comes to that level where heat is just so anyway, what I was trying to say is that we wanted to begin having these conversations, which is why tree planting seemed like it would open up those gates to have those conversations about heat, and it did. But what I didn't expect is that how protective these communities got over these trees that we planted, and how much it exposed underlying social dynamics, which went from Gachkula Koikta community where we saw that they had, some sort of infrastructure, like they had waste management, they had some sort of greenery. Shekhane kintu the trees were taken care of so well. They were calling me, sending me pictures like, Appa, look at how well they're growing. And in some other cases, like for example in Mohakhali Shattola, there was a lot of, we barely managed to plant even 100 trees, and okhane kintu in that settlement, and that is one of the places we received the most challenges from, because the kids were going around and pulling out all the trees. In another settlement, we received a complaint where it turned out that the men didn't like the fact that we were working with women in this project, and the men didn't like that. So the men went around pulling out the trees. But whereas in Korail, there were strong male leaders who came in and who were like took ownership of the trees. So in different areas, 15টা জায়গা লাগাইছি, 15টা এলাকায় we had like different nuanced reactions and nuanced kind of like different kinds of ownership, different kinds of like, how much will I extend myself? Because that is a real we weren't able to pay the people, the communities where we planted trees, right? So we had a partnership of like, acha, you will, the external private partnership was like, somebody would give us the money to plant the trees, somebody would give us the money to hire labor, somebody would give us, like we literally scrapped up budget and funds to plant trees in these areas. And the only thing the community members had to do was to look after them. And if the trees got sick and if the trees needed help, they could call us and we could send a team in and help them. We actually mapped out the trees digitally, so we actually could see it from satellites, like kothay kothay gachgulo lagano hoyeche, what kind of trees were planted. We negotiated with community members to really like figure out, like we had to, because I, as the chief heat officer, I wanted like big shaded trees like korei gach and all of that, and they wanted am gach, they wanted fruit trees. So we had to then find, okay, I'm going in a very detailed year here just so that I can let you know that this is not an overnight process. This takes a long time. All of these conversations, all of this engagement, like it takes so long to really create a locally led adaptive action. And that can, in fact, open up so many conversations. Like if I had not done that, I wouldn't have known that they were getting charged 20 times. Like some community in Kollanpur was paying 20 times the price for per unit for electricity. I wouldn't have known about their access to water in, for example, in Bauniabad. There, you know, when, for example, today there's a heat wave going on and I was feeling so hot and I hopped in my shower. I took a cold shower. I took, you know, pani on korechi and alhamdulillah, like there was cold water flowing. Something as simple as this is not available in like block A in Bauniabad after 1 p.m. because when they turn on the water, it's either boiling hot or it's sewage water. Because when Wasa was laying down the lines and when the city was being built, just to save on money, they put these lines together. And so because of the lack of water pressure now, sometimes when they turn on the tap in the bathroom, there's mala pani coming out. So then what is it? So normal things that you can, like simple things that we all do to protect ourselves from heat. It's not even like electricity at this point. Like it's not even about whether they have water to drink. They don't have water to wash themselves, right? So this is what I meant when I talked about like you have to take a very nuanced approach. The requirements for each community will be very different. And it is a very, and you realize after working, for a while that all the issues are very interconnected and you need the collaboration and you need you need intentional progress. You need people in various levels of government, in various levels of public office or private office to really make deliberate action towards helping out these communities, because it is the way that the city was built, the way that the city has been laid out and planned, and even the bureaucratic processes that it runs by. It is not conducive to people living in marginalized communities. It makes life for them very, very difficult. Their children have to, like the schools, for example, when we talk about heat vulnerability, we all know that women and children are most vulnerable. But something that I ended up doing again through entering these communities through tree planting is we realized that, for example, in Shagufta Housing Society, which is a slum near Bauniabad, their kids were not able to walk to school in the shortest possible route, which would prevent them from being exposed to the sun, because it was the most unsafe route, because they had to cross a road where a lot of speeding cars were coming. It is the Kalshi Road actually. And ওখানে কোনো speed bump ছিল না. There were no traffic warnings, there were like no slowdown, no, school children crossing, no crossing signs, nothing. So we worked with community members there, and we actually ended up implementing a speed breaker, a zebra crossing, signs that bachara ekhane cross korche, and kids began using that road, and that cut down their school traveling time by like half. So instead of taking half an hour to 40 minutes to go to school, they could go in 15 minutes. Every little thing counts. Like when you add these up, when you add up, like, okay, bachara school jacche, you're making the roads safer, quicker. Then you think of school retrofitting. So all the schools ended up being closed, right? And when you think about that, when you think of these communities in particular, and the schools got closed, think of their mothers. Like, who did this? The school closure, whose burden did this increase? Did this actually save the kids or send them back to their hot homes? So we started to think in a reverse direction. So how do we make schools more resilient? So thinking about what Nishat showed in her presentation, what Savio talked about as well, that, how do we make these buildings more resilient? Ajita Hurapa also mentioned, like, building codes, looking at how buildings are built and designed, thinking about wind corridors, orientation to the sun, and also like, egla shopkichu to, that is kind of like formal housing building codes, but what about informal housing building codes? Who are building these, who are the landlords in the informal settlements? Kara bashagula banai diche. Recently, আমি যখন মহাখালী সাততলায়, when I visited মহাখালী সাততলা the last time, which was a couple of months ago, I saw that there were a bunch of new buildings that were replacing the metal buildings. And these new designs would cost the tenants 300 taka more. 300 taka more. So from 2,700 taka per month, they were going to pay 3,000 taka. But these new brick buildings that have replaced the corrugated tin materials did not include windows. So it was like a block of bricks with a door that they now had to keep open all the time. Otherwise, they would, be roasted inside. And because they're having to keep it open, there's mosquitoes and all of those problems. So it's, we really need to, we can't solve everything. That is also something as a CHO that I had to always come to be confronted with, because honestly, it is not possible. Like, this work is so recent, right? Just the minute it took so much advocating, it took so much advocacy to get the Ministry of Disaster, to get the Department of Disaster Management to even consider setting up an SOD for heat. Just last year, I remember sitting with them, and they said that it was, when enough people will die, that's when they will do this. I'm sorry for being so frank, but that is the severity of, that is how things were going. I'm sure now that, we have a lot to learn from the July uprising, because that is a big lesson in how, when you don't hear the people's voices, the people will make you hear it. And it is my utmost wish that in this new Bangladesh, we really build our state to be more resilient, not just in urban spaces, but in rural spaces as well. So that is why we were working on a heat resilience plan and not a heat action plan. The difference is that we would be addressing the systemic and structural challenges, the thermal violence that happens to women every day, the thermal violence that happens to children every day. We would be looking at that. We would be looking at access to essential services and utilities. We would be looking at policies that made it, policies within local government and central government that make it so hard to access climate adaptation funds, that make it so difficult to increase capacity, right? When we talk about we must become more resilient, you cannot do that unless you increase your capacity. So resources are so important here. Human resources, money. Without a budget, without that, you can't really do that. So with that in mind, I know I was a little all over the place. I was, to be honest, very excited to speak here, but I wanted to show you a little bit of something that we developed. I know Adiba just messaged me saying we don't have much time, but I just want to show something. This is a booklet that I was talking about for the last Hurapa. I think you remember I talked to you about this as well, but we finally finished it, and it was part of a survey that we were doing. But I just wanted to show you, this booklet was done for a local gaze, for local people from all over Dhaka to kind of look at it. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we collaborated with the Center for Disability and Development, because, heat affects people with disabilities to a great extent. And so here we defined what is extreme heat. We defined what are the different types of warnings. So what is, and then we talked about, why is heat problematic for our human physical health. And then we went into more detailed on, what are the different types of vulnerabilities. So how are newborns affected? How are children affected? How are school-going kids affected? This is a favorite image of mine, these parents riding with their kids on a motorcycle, because you see it all the time. And heat wave shomoy, this type of, even though I understand that this is not something any parent is doing out of like fun. This is a necessary mode of transport. But during heat waves, it is important for parents and family members traveling with children to be very mindful that kids need some space to breathe, to ventilate. They get hot very, very easily. And so we also talked about women. So this is a very important statement here, which talks about how in most women in Bangladesh prioritize their own well-being at the very last stage, and that is something that we need to change. So here we have pregnant women, we have breastfeeding women, we have we have working women, and here we talked about like how people who are sick, who have comorbidity issues, people who are taking certain kinds of medication, they should really talk to their doctor. How seniors are also affected, how people with disabilities are affected because they need to be taken extra care of during heat season. They need to drink more water, taken to the bathroom more. We also talked about, you can see this for yourself, like, so women on the streets, working in construction, and then, what are the signs of heat waves? What are the different, mental problems that can come out of heat waves? So muscle cramps, we added this part, like, mental health and is still not that widely talked about. So there was a lot of English terminology I wanted to use, but really it was a challenge to translate them. But we wanted to highlight anxiety and depression and irritability, which has caused an increase in domestic violence. So, and then we talked about, what are the সুস্থ থাকতে করণীয় কি কি? So here we have, this is my favorite image, the bottala image. But we talked about, staying mindful of what kind of foods you consume, staying mindful of the water intake, consciously and deliberately seeking out shade when traveling, when outside, using sunscreen wherever possible. And then, this goes on to talk about heat stroke as well. What are the primary things you should do? And if the symptoms persist, then you can go to the hospital. And then what are the foods you should eat? And lastly, what as a society, what as a community, what can we do? Right? These are what the things that we sorry, the last two things were me, but as a community, what are the things that we should do? We need to look out for one another during heat season. That was my message here. I know a lot of people set up water drinking. They collaborated with Footsteps, something that we were also doing to set up water stations in their houses. And then we had this interesting little project here where I know Hurarapa talked about this as well. Like, so your phone, we had an app that, with the recent changes, I'm no longer sure, but this is something that the new government could take a leaf out of, is that we had an app called Shobar Dhaka, যেখানে we had in both English and Bangla version, but it would send you alerts when the temperature would spike, when the heat index would spike. So it wasn't just a temperature reading, it was a heat index reading. And also separate segments for, like, সাধারণ general information for pregnant women. So vulnerability, who, like, if you scroll, you can go through the different vulnerabilities, and you would also be able to access this booklet. So yeah, I just wanted to show you this just really quickly. And how do you stop share? And just so that you have an idea of something that we were working on. And I know I don't have a lot of time to talk about all the other things that we were doing, but I hope I do get a chance in the future to more about this important work. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bushrap. I think that was very enlightening, and I really liked how you started. That, where do we start when you're a chief heat officer of Dhaka North City, because the roadmap is actually not there. And a couple of things I picked up, which I think should be highlighted, is that the booklet is so visualizing that it has a lot of prospects in terms of grabbing attention. So I really hope we make the best utilization of this booklet, going to the local governments, to the local level, and to the different city municipalities, like different mayors, like for example in other cities like in Chittagong, in Rajshahi, where there is also a good amount of people living in those cities. Also, one more thing I wanted to highlight is that, you know, how you mentioned that you have worked in 15 different informal settlements, and all the challenges were different depending on the population, depending on where they're living, depending on the surrounding areas. You know, but that's something that we always need to consider. Like, how do we make sure that you know, when we look at the heat impact or the heat waves, that we create more localized solutions? So that's something that you considered, which is very inspiring. And I also really liked how you have worked on planting trees, and, you know, the community took ownership to really look after them. And I think that's something that a sense of agency and ownership that we always want to push for the local communities in order to tackle the impacts of climate change. And I think we're almost at the end of the session, but I would really like to thank all the presenters, both the panelists, Huerapa and Bushrapu, for joining us. I would like to thank Nishat and also Savio for presenting. I think it was a very rewarding session for myself, at least, and because heat wave is rising and will be, I think, worse in the upcoming years. So I think this is a session that we can reflect on and really learn. And I think it's a learning by doing process. And that's what I got out of this session today. Very inspiring. And thank you again for your valuable time. Hopefully we cross each other's path in the coming future and work collaboratively. Thank you.
Hi, Afsara. We will be taking a picture, actually, a screenshot.
Sure.
I'd like to request everyone to turn on their camera.
Post disabled now.
Perfect. I think it should be done by now. Thank you again to everyone who joined our session, and yeah, have a great weekend and rest of the week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.